Good morning, everyone. It's Monday, April 6th, and we are finally in history class getting into my time proper. We're up to the year 1968. 1968 is the year in Vietnam of the Tet Offensive, which is what we're going to be talking about today. Also, the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., who was, in fact, the anniversary of his assassination was 52 years ago, or was 2 days ago. It's been 52 years since Dr. King was killed in Memphis. And we'll be talking about that some starting next week, more when we get into the civil rights era. Also, the assassination that summer in 1968 of Robert Kennedy, the brother of John F. Kennedy, who was running for president also that year in 1968. And then at the end of that year, who came along but me, December 1968. So, big year for American history and for me, you know. So, with Dr. King's assassination, that was 52 years ago. That's kind of one of those big turning points in American history, and it has connections both with Vietnam and, of course, with the Civil Rights Movement. And we're going to be talking about that some more later this week with the fact that Dr. King very much viewed his opposition to Vietnam as part of his overall fight for justice in America. One of the things that has to do with that is the fact that there were so many African American soldiers fighting in Vietnam for the first time. It was really the first time you had significant numbers of Black American troops fighting in a war overseas. By 1968, you start to really get a lot more opposition on the home front here in America to the war in Vietnam. Americans had been pretty much used to the idea that we won wars. You know, if we got into a war, we won it. And World War II particularly had kind of spoiled us in a way, if you will. It had been a difficult war, World War II, but particularly by 1943, Americans could really look at a map, put a map up on the wall and say, okay, we're here, now we're moving here, now we're moving here, and it was this almost inevitable seeming march toward both Berlin and Tokyo and winning the war. Korea, of course, ended up in a stalemate. So we didn't lose, but we didn't win. That was a little unsettling to people. And then with Vietnam, you get a situation where there's not really even a front line. There's the North Vietnamese troops up there, and we know we're fighting them, but we also have these Viet Cong, these South Vietnamese people who are sympathetic to the communist cause and who are fighting us behind our own lines, essentially. Kind of a guerrilla war. So there's never really a solid stationary front that you can map to project American success and American movement forward. So you start getting more opposition to the war. People start becoming less willing to send their sons and fathers to go off and fight this war. And of course, again, with the media, you also have a lot more video and images projected into people's living rooms of the fighting. And that really shocks Americans for the first time. With World War II, you had a real situation where they didn't allow the publication of pictures of dead GIs. And now for the first time with Vietnam, you get, the American public is seeing dead American soldiers, and that's really, really troubling to people. So in 1968, early 1968, we have what's called the Tet Offensive. Tet, T-E-T, is the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, and so it's a celebration. It's the Vietnamese New Year, and in previous years, up to 1968, the Tet usually happens, I think, in late January. In previous years, before 1968, Tet has been an occasion for kind of a lull in the fighting, a ceasefire almost, while the Vietnamese troops celebrated the Tet. This time, in 1968, they used Tet in order to launch a huge attack on American and South Vietnamese forces up and down the entire peninsula of the country. And it turns out to be a devastating thing for the American troops. So from the book, we have Tet Offensive is the turning point, and I'm going to put all this in the notes that I send you guys today. In November 1967, President Johnson brought General Westmoreland home from Vietnam to address the nation's concerns about the war. General Westmoreland was the American general in charge of everything in Vietnam. Westmoreland said that the Viet Cong, remember the Viet Cong are the South Vietnamese guerrilla forces that are actually fighting for the North Vietnamese communists. Westmoreland said that the Viet Cong were declining in strength and could no longer mount a major offensive. As Westmoreland made his claims, however, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were planning just such an attack. In early 1968, U.S. officials anticipated a communist offensive. As expected, on January 21st, the North Vietnamese army hit Khe Sanh in northwest South Vietnam. However, 9 days later, the communists expanded their attack by hitting U.S. and ARVN, the ARVN being the South Vietnamese Army, positions throughout South Vietnam. The Tet Offensive, named after the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, was a coordinated assault on 36 provincial capitals and 5 major cities, as well as the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. So this is a huge coordinated attack that the American military was not expecting, and that Westmoreland had just come back to the U.S. and told the American people they couldn't launch, and here they are proving him wrong. The communists planned to take and hold the cities until the urban population took up arms in their support. They thought the Tet Offensive had a good chance of ending the war. The fighting was fierce, but in the end, American and South Vietnamese forces repelled the offensive, and there was no popular uprising against the government of South Vietnam. Although U.S. forces won a tactical victory by preventing the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army from achieving their primary objectives, the Tet Offensive was a strategic blow to the Americans. It demonstrated that the communists had not lost the will or the ability to fight on. So this is going to be a huge blow to American forces in Vietnam, suffer a great many casualties, and of course the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong also suffer greatly. But it has proven that they are still in the game. They have not been beaten. This is about 3 years after the American presidents in Vietnam really started ramping up. And the American involvement is going to go on from this point another 5 years until 1973. Okay, after the Tet Offensive, American military leaders seemed less confident of a quick end to the war. When Westmoreland requested more troops, President Johnson asked his new Secretary of Defense, Clark Clifford, to take an objective look at the military and political situation in Vietnam. The deeper Clifford delved into the matter, the more pessimistic he became. Sending more troops would inevitably require raising taxes. You know, Americans don't like raising taxes. Increasing draft rolls and calling up reserves. It would lead to increased casualties in the field and dissent at home, and it still might not lead to victory. Clifford concluded that the president should radically shift U.S. policy from one that pursued victory to one that pursued a negotiated peace. So this is going to be a big turning point here in 1968, where starting to really have some big political ramifications at home, and we're going to see later in the week, on Thursday, I believe, that this situation of the war, particularly beginning with the Tet Offensive, but really throughout 1968, is what convinces Lyndon Johnson not to run for president again. And so that kind of throws things into a big higgledy-piggledy situation, because generally a president who's had a pretty successful first term is going to run for a second term, and they're going to be the odds-on favorite to win. But with Johnson out of the race, that kind of throws everything up in the air. And then, of course, in November 1968, you get the election of Richard Nixon, which leads a few years later to Watergate. So this is going to have huge repercussions down through the rest of American history up to the present day. So, okay, I think that's it for the lecture for today. I'm going to go ahead and get this uploaded, and I will get the completed notes, hopefully by this afternoon, put up on the website. All right, guys.